welcome to the Psychopathology Summit 2018. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Dr. Eva Detko, and my guest for this session is Dave Berger. Dave is Senior Faculty of the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute and an internationally recognized somatic psychotherapist. He teaches somatic experiencing internationally and has developed BASE, which is bodywork and somatic education, touch training for trauma practitioners. As a psychotherapist, body worker, and physical therapist, he has a unique way of integrating the neurobiology of healthy and traumatic responses in both his teaching and his clinical work. Dave has been a professor of physical therapy and psychology and is presently adjunct faculty in the somatic psychology program of JFK University, teaching in their trauma certification program. So Dave, welcome to the Psychopathology Summit. Such a pleasure to have you with us. I'm excited to talk about somatic experiencing with you.
No, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to this as well.
So, why don't we dive straight into it? And perhaps you could start with actually telling everybody, people may not be familiar. So let's just tell everybody what somatic experiencing is, how it sort of came about, and what does it aim to achieve?
Well, what it aims to achieve is to help people out of a perpetual trauma response to overwhelming circumstances. Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing, has been developing it over the course of 40 or 50 years, starting with his doctoral work at UC Berkeley, when he really spent a lot of time studying the autonomic nervous system and noticed that there were some inaccuracies clinically based on the model of the autonomic nervous system that was being used and is still traditionally accepted in neuroscience. And he became very curious about these sorts of things with his own clients and what he was seeing in the lab. And also took a look at the way animals in the wild who are exposed to potential trauma experiences all the time handled that exposure, but don't seem generally to get traumatized. And he applied what he studied in animals to human beings, because after all, we are animals and we have many of the same parts of the brain that they have, and then we have additional parts of the brain as well. And it's this interface and this similarity that we work with in somatic experiencing to help someone overcome overwhelming circumstances, overwhelming experiences in a way that perhaps an animal in the wild might do naturally. But as human beings, we have unique ways that we stop the natural flow of a trauma response so we survive, where a lot of the survival energy gets stuck in our body. Inhibits our nervous system from completing those responses, and our behaviors and our feeling states, as well as things we tell ourselves about how we should or shouldn't do certain things during those kinds of experiences. And so it's really a therapeutic work aimed at bringing forward natural instinctual responses that otherwise get inhibited.
That makes sense. And so let's just talk about some of the basic principles and just telling people how it works, because obviously that's going to be of interest.
Of course. Well, if you think about a traumatic experience, or let's even maybe leave the word trauma out of it for a moment. If we think about experiences that overwhelm us, they tend to happen in a short, compressed amount of time, like a car accident, or being struck by lightning, or falling down the stairs, or they may happen over a long period of time or a repetitive period of time, like living in a challenging environment growing up, whether there's domestic violence or poverty or deprivation and neglect. It can happen over a long period of time, but the physiology, our body, compresses and constricts so that we store all this energy in our system in response to the overwhelm. Because if we feel all the overwhelm at one time, it may do us a lot more harm than if it's stored and we don't feel it all at one time. So one of the major principles of SE is as we help someone renegotiate their physiological, emotional, spiritual response to those experiences, we do it in a way that's very manageable. It's exposure therapy in a way, but not typical exposure therapy. We help expose someone just little bit by little bit to the physiological state as if it was during that experience, but it's in present time. And it's really important to keep someone present time. So I use toys to demonstrate certain principles. So if we think of all this energy that's packed into this slinky, if we open it all up at one time, what happens? There's all this energy and it just collapses. Right? But if we open it up just a little bit at a time and let that vibrate and discharge out, there's greater flexibility in it now. So we can just let a little bit more out until it settles. Okay? So we're exposing someone to that physiological state just a little by a little, so they have more flexibility, more give, and then a little bit more. Right? And that's all that survival energy that has been used, that couldn't be completed at the time, and it's not completed, so we help someone complete it. Okay? So this concept is what we borrow from another science field, chemistry. The concept is called titration, just a drop by a drop by a drop in a way that's manageable emotionally, spiritually, physiologically for the person we're working with, not too much at one time. Okay? And the other principle along with it is with this. This is called a Hoberman sphere. It's very fun. There are tiny little ones you could get. There are big ones children can get into, and you can close it down on them. But with the concept of titrating it, so little by little, we're helping someone's system that's very constricted, very compressed, gradually expand. So if someone goes through life with this much flexibility, their container, their physical body, their emotional state, their psychology has only this much capacity to live in. Gradually, we're helping expand someone's capacity. So they really develop a full range of capacity. And by the time they can do that, they can feel alive again. They can come out of survival mode and into thriving, right? So they develop greater capacity to handle more of that energy and to be alive. So the concept of titrating is a very important one, so they can expand and have greater flexibility. And we do that with another concept. It's about the ability to feel good, but also the ability to feel things we might otherwise not want to feel. That energized state is the sympathetic nervous system, where we rev up, where our heart rate goes up a little, our respiratory rate, our body warms up, like when we walk up a flight of stairs quickly. But also when we're confronted with threat, it goes up a lot for fight or for flight. So we help someone gradually feel that, but then also to pendulate back to the feeling less energy state. So the concept of pendulation between these two states is a very, very important one. A concept of pendulation between this feels okay and this doesn't feel so good. But again, that's in the manageable range. And then back to this feels okay. So we're using people's emotions and thought processes and the meaning making, the physiology to help them move between these states, to pendulate between these states, which also increases their capacity for states of feeling. And they become more regulated that way, the ability to move back and forth without getting stuck in one or stuck in the other.
Perfect. And thank you for the visuals. That really illustrates things nicely. I like that a lot. Talking a little bit more about the process. So basically when you work with somebody and you go through the process of somatic experiences, what does that look like so that people get a better idea?
Well, in many ways, that's a difficult question to answer because it's not a protocol. And so there's no step A, step B, step C. I'll give you an example from one of my very first somatic experiencing sessions. When I was 15 years old, I was riding a bike with a group through New England. And about half a mile or 3/4 of a mile in front of us, there was a car accident. And in that car accident, there was, loud sound, of course, and the visuals. But my survival instincts while I was riding were to immediately turn my bicycle and go off into a ditch on the side of the road and end up with a bent up front wheel. That was the worst thing that happened. Fortunately, my physical body was okay. But I was a little shaken up by it. I was 15. I brushed it off. We got the bicycle fixed, kept riding, and all was good. Until another time I took a fall off a bicycle many, many years later. And I was a little more shaken than I should have been because it was a very small fall. And then as I got interested in somatic experiencing, I had a somatic experiencing session about this this motor vehicle accident where I was riding the bicycle. And the practitioner asked me about what happened. And I started to tell her. We were riding bicycles, we were on this country road, and I saw this car accident, and she noticed me go into this little bit of a startle reflex. My eyes widened and I tightened my body. So she paused me. My physiology, my body expression was saying, this is enough energy in the system right now. Don't do too much. Okay? She asked me what I was feeling. I said, tense, little tense. She said, oh, just give it time. So it mobilized out, mobilized through. I sort of shook it off. I felt better and relaxed a little bit. And then she asked me to tell her more of the story. So we were riding, and I saw this car accident in front, and I did not have the startle now because that had dissipated out. But I looked straight at it and she said, what is it you're seeing right now? And I started to remember some things that I don't even know if I knew them at the time, consciously, cognitively. But I remembered the sounds of the screeching brakes. And I remembered this sparkly stuff on the road. Now, that part I'd never forgotten. But I remembered now that sparkly stuff was actually the sweep of glass coming in my direction. Now, of course, it was far enough away it wasn't going to get me, but I was reacting to that. So as she paused me, more of the story, more of the memories from what happened, the visuals, the sensations came out, emerged from it. And so she again paused me there. She said, wait a minute, just notice what's happening right now. What's happening in your body? What are you thinking? Perhaps there are emotions with that. And as I recalled from present moment what had happened in the past, that sweep of glass, now I could hear some sounds with it. And then a surge of fear came through me. Now, cognitively, I knew that it was far enough away. I was not in danger of getting hit. But physiologically, sensation-wise, emotionally, I was not that aware that I was safe. And this surge of fear came through that I'd never experienced before. Okay? And it was at that moment that I was looking towards safety, so I turned the bicycle with that fear. So I flighted away, right? I flighted away, and then I settled down and I relaxed, and that took a longer time because there was so much more energy packed into me that it was now coming out. And in that process, where she allowed more time for me to settle, I did, and she had me then talk through the story one more time, and now I was able to tell it as a story. There was a little arousal, as there should be. Oh, yeah, that happened, right? But it was no longer a trigger into a fear response, into a level of activation where I had a flight away in that way. And so it really mitigated or helped me renegotiate the response to what happened with that accident. And it had been before that when I'd go out for riding my bicycle. I'm always vigilant. I'm always safe. I've always been safe bike rider. But after that experience, I noticed myself a little bit more tentative. Right? That went away. I'm still safe, but not as tentative. That was a big change. That was a one-time shock trauma, and it's a very easy trauma experience of my own to describe a process with somatic experiencing. Of course, it gets more complex depending on someone's history, but that's a fairly typical way in which we'd work with a shock trauma.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It does really illustrate it quite nicely. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Wondering whether you also, in your work, working with people with various levels of trauma, various types of trauma, whether you actually have worked with people with autoimmune conditions who are basically stuck in the illness because they have unresolved trauma.
When people have medical issues and chronic, like irritable bowel syndrome or chronic fatigue or other syndromal problems, it's complex. And so somatic experiencing can be extremely helpful. And of course, people need multiple modalities. They need good nutrition. They need medical intervention. They may need naturopathic medical intervention. Exercise is really important. But how it's done is very important too. It needs to all be working together in a way that helps someone to gradually come out of the place that they're in and into a new state of being. If it happens too much too quickly, it's like getting traumatized again, even in the healing process. I see a lot of people with chronic pain, a lot of different kinds of chronic pain. And that's very changeable. Now, if someone has a structural problem like a disc herniation or some other sort of organic thing, that's a little bit different, can still help a lot with easing up the pain. But then there are a lot of pain syndromes, for example, that are not specifically structurally involved. And these are some of the autoimmune pain problems, and somatic experiencing can be very, very helpful. Yes.
So, yeah, that's great to know. I thought this much, but yeah, that's great to know. Could you talk a little bit more about the research behind it? Because you did say that this modality is based on neuroscientific principles, but what would be of interest if there's actually has been any research specifically looking at somatic experiencing and the efficacy of using this modality to heal trauma?
Mm-hmm. There have been a few published studies, and all of those can be found on our website, which is traumahealing.org. That's the website for the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute. The most recent one, which is probably the largest study that has been done and showed very, very good results, was done by a colleague of mine, Gina Ross, in Israel. And it was a very well-established where they looked at upwards of 80 or 85% reduction of post-traumatic stress disorder using some somatic experiencing. Very highly done study, well done study. There have been some others after the tsunami in Thailand several years ago. There was more of a field study done, and that's been published also again on the website. And there have been a few others in Social Work magazine as well. And there are a number of studies that are in the process of happening right now. The Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute does have a research arm to it that's run through the board of directors. So I'd recommend people go to the website to look for the specific articles about it.
Yeah, and I actually had a really great conversation with Gina as well.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we've got her here as one of the contributors. So, yeah, I am familiar with her work. That's great. Thank you for that. So I'm going to kind of ask you to perhaps, if you can, share other sort of examples of SE in action where maybe you used it, maybe it was used on yourself, and maybe it was used on somebody you work with, and you had a wonderful transformation as a result of using it.
Sure. Once people go through the somatic experiencing training, which I can talk about as well, it becomes a framework for how they work. If they're adding it to body work or physical therapy, their psychoanalytic practice or marriage family therapy, it becomes one of the frameworks of how they integrate their modalities together. Yeah, sure. I can talk about somebody. This is a woman who had number of kind of trauma experiences, including some concussions. And somatic experiencing is both a sitting psychotherapeutic model, and there's a hands-on work with it as well. And the first phases of working with her was sitting up psychotherapy model, very similar to how I described my bicycle accident in terms of what happened, and pausing her as the object that hit her was coming closer so she could feel what her body wanted to do, but she went into this shock state, a state of freeze, where trying to protect herself from it couldn't happen because things happened so quickly and she got hit. And so we work with that. If your arms or body could have done anything, what do you imagine they might have done? Can you feel what they want to do? They want to move up. Feel them move up. So she played with that movement to block the object from hitting her. Even though it actually happened, but her body, it's really renegotiating the body's response to this overwhelming circumstance. It's not the circumstance itself. So she could feel her blocking it. She could feel the distance now. Have her put her hands down, rest, relax, and then have her go through it again. And at a certain point, it's important that someone comes to what actually did happen, and that they feel what they could not feel then, because they dissociate. We're built to not feel what happens to us. We're designed that way. There's a whole biochemistry cascade that stops us from feeling physically, emotionally, etc. It puts us into a state like death, so we don't feel, so that we can survive. And she could now feel consciously, present time, what happened then is getting hit and her brain hitting around inside her skull. And it didn't feel good, but it was almost like a shadow of the feeling of what really happened. It wasn't with the same degree of intensity. And then, again, that was enough, settled, and came out of that state gradually, looked around, a little disoriented, which would make sense, but she's orienting, and her vision gets more clear, because one of the things that happens when we go into a shock state is our vision first gets wide and then gets very narrowed. And if we get stuck in that state at any level, our vision isn't as broad and as acute as it would otherwise be. Her vision really broadened, so she could now see the whole room. She could see where she was. So she's much more oriented in time and space. Then we did some work on the table where I was working more directly with areas of the body that inhibit the flow of emotions, so the flow could come back into her body. Came up and did some work with her head and her brain to ease the flow of that. One of the things that happens with a concussion, or can happen with a concussion, as with many kind of trauma experiences like anesthesia or near drowning or being strangled by somebody else, is that we go into the shock state like we are dead. We feign death so that we can live, survive, but not thrive yet. And as we come out of that, we can feel ourselves enliven again. And I just simply asked her to say that again and to hear her words, I'm alive. I'm alive. And just this huge, huge shaking, brief shake, deep tremor, heat came through her. And it was the first time since she'd had that traumatic experience that she felt alive. She lived. She got it physiologically, emotionally, spiritually, that she was alive. Before that, she was going through the steps of life, but she wasn't alive.
Thank you for sharing that case study. And actually, again, it just illustrates the process really well. So would there ever be a situation that you wouldn't work with? Are there any contraindications to using somatic experiencing?
It's a really important question. A few, and I say it a little hesitantly. If someone's got an acute medical situation going on and they've been traumatized, those are two different things: medical injury, physical injury, and trauma, but they often go together. If it's acute, you don't want to do anything on the nervous system side that's going to increase the charge in their system, because that hijacks metabolic energy from the immune system, which is our first line of defense during any trauma experience, even when it doesn't include physical injury. It's a first line of defense because it's mobilized. So we don't want to do anything on that end. But certainly talking healthfully, skillfully, appropriately, you're going to be okay. We're here to help. You'll get through this. I'm right here with you to help anchor somebody, ground somebody, bring someone's energy levels down a little bit. That aspect of somatic experiencing can be very, very helpful, but nothing in the upcharge direction yet. Once they're medically stable, then depending on your scope of practice, your expertise, your skill level, your comfort level, you can begin working with the medical circumstance vis-a-vis the trauma response as well. I don't personally have an expertise in working with someone with psychosis or schizophrenia or other mental health challenges like that. But for the most part, SE is applicable across a range of disciplines and a range of behavioral manifestations of trauma. And we have people in our trainings who are psychotherapists of many different kind of licenses, psychologists, social workers, marriage, family therapy, for example, psychiatry. We have medical doctors, naturopaths, physical therapists, body workers, many different kinds of body work. Really anybody who helps people who have trauma histories, who are dysregulated, don't have this ease and flexibility to come back into a stable state.
Actually, it's really good to know that it integrates well with other modalities. That's certainly a great thing. I wanted to ask you also about the body work and somatic education that you have developed. Could you actually tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, be happy to. It's a way of working mostly, not 100%, but mostly with very refined, detailed, hands-on skills. When someone's been traumatized, their autonomic nervous system, the nervous system that allows us to function, but we don't have to think about it, goes into a dysregulated state. Well, every structure in the body, every organ, every tissue in the body, all have their own rhythm and movement and need to work in this range to allow this rhythm and movement to happen easily. And when we're traumatized, it's not uncommon that different organs, different structures don't have, it's called motility, the movement and flow of organs and structures and tissues. They go out of sync. They go out of a more regulated state and into like a mini freeze, let's say, of their own. And so in this work, it integrates a number of different things. Peter Levine's work in SE, Marion Rosen, who developed Rosen Method Bodywork, some of the work I developed on my own of working in a very, very refined, finessed way to help structures in the body come out of freeze and into a more regulated state. So as structures come into more regulated state with the way we use our touch and our intention and our focused attention, emotional states can regulate as well. So there's a lot of hands-on the table with BASE, and then there's work off of the table as well in essentially a question of how can you help the entire body as a structural entity come into a regulated state by using the musculoskeletal system itself, in addition to the organs and the tissues. So we do some movement work and posture. I develop shifting posture into different ways to feel more regulated. I actually developed a word because in English, there's no one word for posture and emotion or posture and attitude. So I developed a word in English. I call it posturetude, posture plus attitude, and how we use our physical body in a way of more ease and regulation, and do that in relationship with other people too. So we take all this work from base and then bring it into somatic couples work. How do you work relationally with couples using the structures of the body in attachment work, attachment trauma, and using the body to repair when there's relational trauma.
That sounds really interesting. Fantastic. Thank you. And going back to somatic experiencing for a moment, if people want to find out more about it, or indeed of the base method that you've just described, what's the best resource? Or perhaps they want to find a practitioner. What's the best resource? Is it the same website that you've given previously?
For base, it's my website, daveberger.net. For somatic experiencing, traumahealing.org. We do have a very large somatic experiencing community in Europe and in South America. Brazil is where most of our faculty are from, in South America. We have large numbers of people trained in somatic experiencing in Asia and in Australia. So really all over the world. But traumahealing.org for somatic experiencing is a great resource, and daveberger.net for base.
Great. And what about, say, for any practitioners watching who may be interested in the training itself? Could you tell us more about the training?
Of course. For the somatic experiencing training, it's an extensive training. It's a 3-year training, and it's a build. 1 year builds on the next year, builds on the next year from the prior year. And we go through the first years, all the basics of SE, how we view the formation of trauma, some of the science behind it and supporting SE, some of the concepts, many of the concepts and application of the concepts. When people are comfortable with that and have a sense of that, then in the second year, we go through what's called categories of trauma, or different kind of trauma experiences and ways to work with them. So they all have a basic foundation of what happens when confronted with threat, but each one has nuances and variations on how to work with them, what to see and expect, depending on the kind of experience that someone's had and the complexity. The third year of the training is devoted to working with complex PTSD and syndromes, as we were talking about earlier, because they are very complex, and helps a somatic experiencing student refine their skills. My base training is a 1-year training. There are four modules of that, and in each one, we steep ourselves in different aspects, different parts of the body, different organs, different tissues, using the whole structure of the body, and then into the couples work.
And do you actually have to be an SE practitioner to do your base training?
No. Most of the people that take it are SE practitioners, but you don't have to be. Some work with trauma as a body worker, as a psychotherapist is very, very helpful, and will add to what they're already doing. But you don't have to have been through the SE training only.
Great. And so, one more question I want to ask you about SE itself as a modality. Are people able to actually use it on themselves at any stage of the process?
That's such a great question. Yes, to a certain point. Knowing the principles, knowing what our biological being is supposed to go through when we confront something that's been overwhelming, and allowing that process to go as far as it can naturally is really important. And we can tell ourselves that and allow for it, make space for that, and to a certain extent disinhibit anything that might prevent that from happening. And that can go a long way at mitigating a trauma response. And there is something about being witnessed that is extremely important and helpful for two reasons. One reason is that we are social beings. We're social animals. We, as much as we like to know it, believe it, but be afraid of it, sometimes we like and need other people to support us and help us. And that's very, very helpful. And because of the other reason, which is that we all have blind spots to ourselves. Jung said the problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious. A colleague of mine, another senior SC faculty member, Raja Selvam, says the problem with the unconscious is that it's conscious to everybody but us. It's unconscious to us. And so we have blind spots. So to be facilitated through this process means facilitating us in the areas that we can't see within ourselves. So we can help ourselves to a certain extent, but not necessarily entirely.
Yes, that's definitely going to be true for whatever modality you actually choose to work with. Oh, that's more sort of universal, what you've just shared. Thank you so much for talking about somatic experiencing and also your own method. That's really, really interesting. I wanted to ask you before we end whether there's anything else that you wanted to add, anything you wanted to share with the viewers that you haven't already, any final words of wisdom?
You're welcome, and thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it. I'll quote Peter Levine, and he says, "Trauma is not a life sentence." That, and what he means is that it's changeable. Our response is changeable, and I like to say we can help people move from surviving to thriving.
That's great. Wonderful final message. Absolutely. I'm completely echoing what you're saying. People don't have to be stuck in this miserable emotional state. And as you said, just really surviving rather than living and thriving. It's absolutely possible to turn it around. So thank you so much, Dave. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Massive appreciation from everybody here watching and obviously myself. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this interview and if you'd like a lifetime access to all of the interviews as well as some fantastic exclusive bonuses, then the information on how to get your All Access Pass is right here on this page.